Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of two Panther Alumni event weeks hosted by FIU in Washington, D.C. I'm Eric, the Associate Director of FIU in D.C., reporting to you this morning live from Washington. You probably already know that Panther Alumni Week is a university-wide affair, and if you haven't visited paw.fiu.edu, you can see some of the other great events hosted by the various colleges, universities, and departments at the university to connect our current students and alumni. If this happens to be one of your first interactions with FIU in DC, I'll tell you a little bit about what we do, which basically falls under three pillars. One, we represent the university here in Washington as federal advocates for our research priorities, making sure our members of Congress from South Florida and relevant committees know what our researchers are up to and can have that new knowledge inform their legislation and can continue to support FIU research programs in the federal budget. Our idea exchange goes beyond just students and DC-based experts and positions FIU as a convener of dialogue among all relevant parties around issues where we are experts from Latin America policy to environmental and water quality to developing cybersecurity training programs. And the Talent Lab, that's what I'm all about. That's what this program is part of. This is all of our programs to support students and alumni in getting DC-based internships and careers. And that involves not only getting placed in those careers, but being prepared to understand how the DC policy ecosystem works, which is what an event like today is all about. So we have two panelists today. It is Panther Alumni Week, so one of our panelists is a proud FIU alumnus, Orga Cadet. He is an associate in the international trade and national security practice at the BakerHostetler law firm, and this makes him very well positioned to discuss some of the tech policy issues today that particularly relate to national security and when companies are owned by or hosted by some foreign governments or companies. And we also have a very excited special DC-based, I believe, expert guest. Emily Birnbaum is a technology policy reporter. And every topic that I will ask them about today, Emily has written an article about. So I'm very excited to get her insights on some of this. And I'll share some news article links as we go, including some written by her. So Emily, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I really appreciate you being here. To promote two things before I jump into the first question, I mentioned this is one of two FIU and DC Panther Alumni Week events. The second one is tomorrow at 2. It's focused on the private space industry, private companies working in rockets and space exploration and whatnot. We have two alumni, one who's in charge of developing space business for the Australian government at the embassy here in DC, and one who's out on the West Coast as a rocket engineer for Blue Origin, which Jeff Bezos will probably come up in our conversation today too, but one reason that he was leaving as CEO of Amazon was to focus on some of the other businesses, including that one. So I'm going to post the link to tomorrow's event in the chat, and I hope to see some of you again there as well. The other thing I just pasted in the chat is we do have a application active for one of our 3-day policy seminars. This one happens to be focused on the intersection of a resilient environment, a strong economy, and national security. National security being a part of the theme of today's conversation as well. Policy seminars expose you to congressional offices, federal agencies, think tanks, advocacy groups, corporate lobbyists, et cetera, around the topic. And so if you care about the environment, the economy, or national security, this might be one for you. And you can visit flying.fiu.edu to learn more about the format and the dates and to apply for that. So without further ado, if you're a student, alumnus, or alumna, or guest, feel free to take a moment to introduce yourself into the chat so we know who's here, what brought you to this particular event today, why you care about tech policy, if you're a student, etc. And the way questions are going to work, by the way, you can ask questions in the chat at any time. I have my list of questions that I'm going to get started with. I'm going to be monitoring the chat for questions. You don't have to wait for me to ask for questions. And when the time is right, I will ask you, if you're able, to come on audio and video to ask that over video. And the questions will be turned over to you all participants as soon as possible. Okay, so to get started, The title of this event is TikTok and Tech Policy. TikTok is only one example that we'll cover, but it is the one in the title. And it is one that in addition to both panelists, Orga, who's our alumnus for Panther Alumni Week, is well positioned to discuss from the national security standpoint. So Orga, what was going on, what is going on, why was the government looking to ban TikTok? Did it ever happen? Could they have done it in the first place from your vantage point? Is it still owned by China? How does all of this relate to U.S.-China relations in the big picture?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It wasn't such a long time ago that I was an FIU student, at least it doesn't feel that way. And so I really wish I had programs like this to kind of give me a sense of what's happening in DC. So hats off to you, Eric. So with regard to TikTok, I'll sort of take a step back and explain the history of the company. TikTok was a Chinese company. And then in 2017, because it was so popular in China, it decided to expand into the US. And the way it did that was by purchasing a US company called Musical.ly. So it purchased that company in 2017 and renamed it TikTok, and kept all of that company's users. Starting in 2018, TikTok just absolutely exploded. It went from about 10 million users to over 100 million users in the US. And these are monthly active users, so people who log in at least once a month. At this point, the company that owns TikTok, it's called ByteDance, a Chinese company. It became the most valuable startup in the entire world, which says a lot. There are a lot of very valuable startups in the US. At this point, it started becoming more of an issue that was at the top of the priority for a lot of politicians and a lot of data privacy groups. So soldiers were using it. Certain politicians were using it. Congressional staffers were using it. Intel analysts were using TikTok. And the concerns here are the user data that TikTok has and thereby China has. So this can be location data. It can be your name, your address. It can be your private communications with other people on TikTok. It can be your photos, your videos that any foreign government can use as part of their facial recognition technology. And so a variety of politicians across the aisle, including Marco Rubio and Chuck Schumer, they all reached out to the US government to say, hey, we're a little concerned that China can have all this information about millions and millions of US citizens. And we would want you to take a look at this transaction in 2017 and see if you can impose limits on it or even unwind it. And so that brings us to 2020. The US government ultimately did look into this transaction, and President Trump issued two executive orders. One required ByteDance to divest from TikTok. So in essence, to sell its ownership shares in TikTok. That is still working its way through the government process. And the company that owns TikTok also sued the government over this. So it's still working its way through the courts as well. And we can talk about that in more detail, but there are free speech issues involved there as well, because people do use TikTok for getting their political opinions out. The second executive order Trump issued essentially attempted to ban TikTok from US app stores. TikTok also sued the government on this, and that's working its way through the courts. And so because of these issues, what has traditionally been seen as a pretty innocuous thing, social media, you just kind of go there and post videos of your funny dances and hang out with your friends online, has become something that the US government is very, very concerned about. And it's not just the US government concerned about national security, it's industry groups concerned about that too. It's civic organizations like the ACLU being worried about freedom of speech issues. And so it touches on a lot of different very important issues.
Thanks, Orga. And your bringing up of industry groups and advocacy organizations is a great segue because Emily, I'll invite you to add anything onto the TikTok conversation from your reporting, but also then to transition into stepping back from this one example of tech policy. I would like to provide a broader understanding of how it is advocated for and implemented. So what are the congressional committees, federal agencies that tend to be involved here? What are the outside players like industry groups and advocacy organizations that try to influence what happens? And what's it like dealing with all those different entities while reporting on tech policy, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing that I would add about TikTok is now it's one of the most major questions facing, President Biden. Like, what is he going to do about TikTok? Because a lot of these executive orders that Trump signed, they're, like they can easily be overturned. They're kind of caught up in the courts. Like nothing has really happened. Like TikTok, clearly you can access it on your phone. I do every single day. And I think Biden has made it clear that he has kind of concerns about data privacy and privacy, like your privacy when there's a Chinese-owned company involved. But his government is going to take a very different approach than Trump in that it's going to be far more unified. It's not just going to be like this company or that is what they've said, but it's actually going to be like a whole of government approach to how do we think about China, which I'm really interested to see what Biden is going to do about TikTok as I said, an avid user. And so to the question of like, who has control over tech policy in Washington, I'll start with Congress. So I think one of the things that led me to really want to cover tech policy is that it's actually very unresolved who oversees these enormous companies that control like every aspect of our everyday lives. So Congress still hasn't, there are not like tech specific committees in Congress exactly. Like there are committees that have broad jurisdiction, including tech issues. They've sort of evolved to take on tech as part of their central jurisdiction. So that's the judiciary committees in both chambers. They have some say over the Department of Justice. They oversee the Department of Justice, which oversees antitrust issues. So then tech falls under their jurisdiction, and some things to do with encryption and other questions like that, and also the national security implications of China is within Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction. And then there's the Commerce Committee, which has one of the largest jurisdictions in Congress, in the House and the Senate. They deal with healthcare, they deal with trade, they deal with infrastructure, and they deal with tech, and they deal with communications and telecom issues, which already there's a lot of wrangling in Congress over who has jurisdiction over what tech issue, which can sometimes come be at the benefit of the major players here. So like obviously Silicon Valley pours an unbelievable amount of money into lobbying in Washington every single year. I feel like every quarter there's a new story that's like, they broke records and how much they've spent to sway policymakers on some of the questions facing them. So you mentioned, I think, the Internet Association. That's a very important trade group, but there's definitely over a dozen, and I'd be surprised if there wasn't 24 trade groups that basically all they do is try to promote various tech priorities in Washington. So some of them represent Silicon Valley, some of them represent enterprise companies, and there's a ton of money in that ecosystem. And then one step beyond them, there are these lobbying firms who are just known for having a lot of tech clients. And so that's also a very important and much more secretive, if that makes sense, element of Washington lobbying. So I think the question of like, what is it like to report on some of this stuff is you're just constantly navigating private interests. And that doesn't even get at the fact that a lot of the think tanks in Washington are funded by some of the major players. Like Google funds nearly every think tank. And then you have to, question and think really critically about the kind of research that you are looking at every day.
Awesome, thank you for that. And then a hot off the press item, if you will. Just yesterday, our governor of Florida proposed some legislation to try to regulate social media companies and particularly to fine them if they, among other things, ban any users that are statewide office seekers. And so not necessarily whether or not that legislation itself is a good piece of one or not. Have we seen states try to get into this regulatory battle before? Is there any unique challenges that would happen if states end up getting involved in this system?
I'm not familiar with any, but you know, I would imagine that would be a jurisdictional issue, maybe even an issue related to the U.S. Constitution. If these companies are operating in various states, but one state denies a person the right to access that that particular website, I can imagine that other states could sue on behalf of the company.
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing question, I think, at least as it relates to privacy. So privacy legislation, like the US is the only Western democracy that doesn't have some sort of federal, national privacy framework or even a specific privacy regulator. And so Congress has spent a long time trying to figure this out. There's still these issues that Democrats and Republicans can't agree on. But at the state level, there are tons of privacy bills moving. And in California, there's been serious privacy legislation passed. So at this point, I think the line from the tech companies that you hear a lot is like, now it's a patchwork of state laws, which makes it really difficult to operate your business. It's prohibitive in some ways to, like you just want one framework for the whole country, because if that's a regulation, then okay, then you can follow those guidelines. But it's much harder when it, is state by state. And so I think the legislation that you're talking about specifically, it rarely can get through any legislature because it is a politicized topic, the question of like banning and the question of how you treat speech on platforms. But privacy really is one of those issues that's like moving at the state level, and the government is like racing to catch up and is not able to do so.
Thank you both. I want to take a few moments to acknowledge some of the folks that we have as participants, because I can totally see why they're here. First of all, we have our director of social media for the university, Joel, avid TikTok fan, as he says in the chat here. We appreciate all his help promoting FIU and DC's good work. And then in terms of students, Rosanna is interested in cybersecurity, couldn't be more relevant to this. Laurie is with interest in pre-law. We have Orga here. Eugen is international business, couldn't be more relevant. And of course, our both alumna and public administration faculty member, Charlene, who's focused on national security and cybersecurity. So a very good group here. And Charlene already has a question that we'll get to soon. To go back to Orga for a little, to focus on the international angle of this. TikTok is one example. We recently saw Parler get taken offline by Amazon's web services. And from what I understand, tell me if this is still up to date, it's being hosted by a Russian-owned company. And speaking of Amazon, it was announced yesterday that the head of their cloud services will become the CEO of the company. And that person, Andy Jassy, has previously been interviewed. I sent you the link to this Twitter just before the event started, saying that, yeah, Amazon has no problem selling their facial recognition software to foreign governments as long as it's legal to do so, and acknowledge that in some cases it's not legal to do so. What laws regulate this this sort of thing, and why is it important, and what's up with Parler?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first question. So there are a broad set of laws called export controls that regulate when a U.S. company or a U.S. individual can export certain products or software. And within this broad set, there are two kind of subsets. One is called the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. Those regulations focus on mostly products that have a military use. So think about the fact that a company can't just export a tank or a military jet without a specific license from the US government. And then there's a second sort of subset of export control laws under the Export Administration Regulations. Those regulations focus on anything that can be used for a pretty innocuous reason. So for example, facial recognition, you can use that just to, secure as a security feature for a commercial building, or you can use that in a pretty nefarious way. And so some of these items need a specific license. So with facial recognition technology, at this point, it would depend on what precisely is being exported. But the US government is already in the process of adding what's called emerging and foundational technologies to the export control laws. Facial recognition is one of them. AI is another one. Quantum computing is a third, and there are a whole lot of others. And so, yeah, facial recognition would generally be a thing that the U.S. government could require a license for or prohibit the export of. And with respect to Parler, yeah, it's being hosted using Russian servers now, and that presents a whole lot of national security issues. As of recently, Parler has more than 10 million users, I think about 12 million now. And the concern is similar to TikTok. Russia could access the personal data of these users. Russia has very strict laws about tech companies operating there, essentially that require these tech companies to give the government of Russia information that Russia requests. And so that's one way for the Russian government to access this information. But Russia also has a vast physical network where they can monitor everything from web user IP addresses to communications on the internet. And so it is a concern that Parler has a whole lot of US users and is being hosted in Russia.
Emily, a phrase that comes up a lot in tech policy, which if our students haven't noticed, I'm sure they'll start noticing it after we discuss it here because it's everywhere, is Section 230. I've just posted a far more links than people probably want to read about it in the chat, including one you wrote. And it seems to be something that's quite misunderstood. And one of the more entertaining and informative articles to read is the first one that is titled, "Hello, you've been referred here because you're wrong about Section 230. So can you tell us what it is, what it means, how it's misunderstood, and if it's working or should be changed in any way, in your opinion?"
Yeah. Okay. So Section 230 is a provision in a law passed in the 1990s called the Communications Decency Act. Much of that law has been struck down, but Section 230 has remained. It essentially, it came about because when the internet was being created, like the internet as we know it today was being created, a lot of the internet relies on posts from various users. Like you could think about like Yelp or think about like early forums, like that. A lot of that content is being generated by everyday people. And if the website hosting that material could be sued for the horrible things that people say on the internet, they would all be completely run out of business immediately. So the need there was to protect these platforms from being like just sued out of existence constantly for speech on their platform. So it is a liability protection, a liability shield, basically that says, online platforms can't be sued for a lot of the content that is posted on their sites. It doesn't apply to things that are like illegal. There are carve-outs. There was an important carve-out in 2017 for content that facilitates sex trafficking, which is like its own complicated thing. But basically, so it has that element of it, and it has another element which says these websites can do whatever they want to moderate that content. So they can take things down, they can leave things up. They are totally allowed, and they can't be sued for that. That's the key part, is the like being sued part. And yeah, it's become somewhat of a political football, because like it makes sense intuitively. Like there is a lot of anger among both parties at Facebook, at YouTube, at Twitter, all these sites that directly rely on 230. Like Republicans say that all of these social media platforms remove too much conservative speech, and they routinely take action against right-wing users, which there is no evidence to substantiate. And then on the left, they say these sites are just keeping up things like misinformation or threats or like all the like horrific stuff that is online. So then the question becomes, should they have more responsibility? Should they be liable for this stuff? And I think the conversation about 230 right now is incredibly polarized in Washington. Like it's more like I think of this conversation as more political than policy, at least right now. Like now that Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and President Biden has signaled that he thinks that something should be done to the law, it's possible that there will be actual movement, but it's an incredibly complicated thing. Like if you start to poke holes in 230, then you're hitting at something that's at the core of the internet as we know it. And so a lot of smaller sites than Facebook have said, we don't want to be, we don't want to be punished for the things that you're mad at Facebook about. So I'm thinking about like Reddit or Pinterest, like they need 230 as well. And that's sort of like the state of the conversation. There's so many proposals on the table. I did like a timeline of proposals from the last year alone, and there were like over like 18 separate proposals from policymakers. But yeah, we're definitely at an inflection point with it, but I think nobody really knows where that political energy is going to go.
Awesome, thank you. And before I turn it over to Charlene for her question, did either of you have anything to say about kind of the questions I asked each other? So if Orga had any Section 230 insights, or Emily had any selling facial recognition to foreign governments, or Parler in Russia, make sure you have the chance to address before we get too far away. Okay. I saw Orga unmute, so I just want to make sure that he's.
Oh, no, I was just going to say one other industry organization that you all might want to be aware of is the Information Technology Industry Council. They do a lot of work on these data privacy issues, and including on Section 230.
Awesome. We also have an alumnus of ours who's now communications director at TechNet, which is another kind of relevant group. So it's always fun to try to map out and remember all the players in a space like this. So while Charlene asks her question, I'm going to encourage others to chat your question into the chat, so I know you have them. I see some very interesting students and colleagues in the room, and we'll hear from you. If you're able to ask over audio and video, I prefer that. If you're listening from work or class and need me to read it for you, just note that in the chat and I'll do that. But love to see you and hear you if we can. Charlene?
Yes, hi. Thank you both for doing this panel. I think this is really great and informative. One question that I had regarding the TikTok ban, I guess you could say, is how much of a concern was that? How much did the concern play as far as AI technology is concerned? And especially because the US seems to trail a little bit behind China with regards to AI developments. And then also, is that linked with disinformation preoccupations or, issues with that as well?
Yeah, so it's not clear how much of a role AI played. It is clear that TikTok's algorithm is sort of the engine of the company, and the U.S. certainly wants to keep that in the U.S. If it can. But disinformation and misinformation played a huge role in this. So the U.S. was concerned as part of the court case challenging the TikTok ban. The U.S. had to release an internal memorandum that they drafted, basically breaking down what they were concerned about. And disinformation, misinformation was absolutely one of them. So it could be anything from China scrubbing TikTok of any information about, say, the Uyghurs, or China censoring speech on TikTok when it comes to COVID-19 and its origins. And so, yeah, disinformation, misinformation, especially in the context of the role that it played in the 2016 election and the role that it's played since then in every election is extremely concerning. It's not only on TikTok, but disinformation, misinformation spreads on every social media platform, and it's a huge struggle to contain that. But just a few weeks ago, we saw how disinformation and misinformation about the results of the most recent presidential election led to an insurrection at the Capitol. And so it is a very, very powerful tool that a foreign government could have over US citizens.
Yeah, and I kind of like want to say I totally agree with your like thesis about like, did this have to do with the way the US lags technologically behind China in some areas? Like, I think probably if we think about the US-China tech relationship, we have to like, you have to acknowledge in some way that it's not just purely national security concerns, that like China is also ahead of us in some areas. We are a little bit ahead of them, but in a genuine race in other areas of like, you know, technological innovation. And like some of the hawkishness from the US will inevitably be to kneecap, you know, Chinese companies that are getting ahead. And that is just a reality of this like, you know, trade war, this like standoff we're in. You know, they will do certain things, you know, like a lot of our social media companies are banned in China. A lot of Chinese or US things are banned in China. And it's sort of like we are responding in kind at this point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both. I'm curious if any concerns around data privacy and what's allowed, you know, under US laws and regulations or anything else in the tech policy sphere influences each of your own personal, you know, use of social media or other tech products that you use them as normal, or you're hesitant about what you share, or you use some apps or not others in your personal life.
Yeah, I mean, so okay, the answer is kind of complicated. So I actually just knowing, you know, what I do about Apple versus Google is something that orients a lot of my life. So like Apple is constructed, like central to its mission is being a privacy focused company. And so in general, I like tend to use Apple products more often. Not that Apple is perfect, but like I try to use like Apple Maps. It's like their mission is to protect your privacy and to protect your identity, versus Google, where a lot of their business model relies on, you know, the mass collection of data because they are, you know, an ad service at the end of the day, or that, you know, is their primary financial engine. And I think, I mean, I said before that like I continue to use TikTok, even though I've read extensively about some of the national security concerns, because I think it's still an open question as to whether, you know, what is real and what is just kind of conjecture or paranoia. And I also do tend to use some of the encrypted messaging apps more often. So I am partial to Signal, as I think most journalists who talk about some confidential stuff should be.
I agree with all of that. So for me, I don't use social media a whole lot. And so that kind of cuts down on my need to sort of toggle with the data privacy switches or scrub metadata from photos and such. But when I do use social media, I make sure that I think about whether or not my profile is public versus private and only visible to those who follow me or those who I'm close to. So that's about the extent of it. But I agree with everything Emily said in relation to the Apple versus Google divide.
Yeah, and I also think that like in general, a lot of time when I've talked about privacy concerns, friends will say like, oh, well, I have nothing to hide. Like, I don't really care. But I think of this as more of like a philosophical question. It's sort of like, maybe it doesn't matter to you, but do you think like it matters to an activist who's like actively seeking to push against governmental power? Like, do you think it matters to some of the most surveilled communities in our country, which like, as we know, tends to be Black and brown communities? Like, I think it's more like there are like moral questions around privacy that are very compelling and important, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And even if you don't think it matters to you, you know, now, maybe it will matter to you later on. So.
Right, exactly.
It wouldn't be a good student-oriented event without some conversation of career advice and insights. So whether they are specific to your paths to being an attorney dealing with this type of thing specifically, or a journalist dealing with this type of thing specifically, or just the broader kind of DC infrastructure and how to learn the types of jobs and organizations that deal at the intersection of technology and policy, whether governmental or outside of the government. What would you like to share about your path to what you're currently doing, any unexpected turns, and any career advice for our students?
Yeah, I would say that pretty much everything nowadays touches on technology and policy. When I was in law school, I interned at the Federal Trade Commission, and now they're leading a lawsuit against Facebook for the reasons that Facebook might be acting in a monopolistic way. The Commerce Department does a whole lot when it comes to technology and policy, especially in the context of export controls. The space industry is exploding. I know we'll hear more about that tomorrow at the FIU, the second FIU Panther Week event. So, SpaceX had, and Blue Origin, they build giant rockets, and those rockets have missile technology, essentially, and avionics related technology. And so those are all companies that a student could look at if they're interested in technology and policy issues.
Yeah, I don't know how many people in here would want to be a journalist. If anybody does, then I'm happy to answer questions about that. But if you're interested in being in this ecosystem, when I became a journalist who covers tech in Washington, you have to become aware of the broader ecosystem. So that ecosystem, there's Congress and the agencies that deal with tech issues at the center, alongside the tech companies. That's where a lot of these major battles are playing out. And then surrounding, there are so many groups trying to influence them. So there's activist groups who fight for digital rights. So that's free press or public knowledge. And then there's the tech trade groups that I was talking about before. There's the Internet Association. There's just so many. There's the think tank world. All major think tanks in Washington have a tech policy section if you're interested in research. So I think that it really just depends on what are your skills. Do you like to research? Do you like to advocate? Do you like to whatever kind of skills, and they can fit in anywhere in that broader ecosystem.
I will throw one more kind of journalistic question at you then, because I see that you have been in the kind of a specific DC journalism sphere. From I'm reading now on Protocol's site that it's shares a publisher with Politico, which is a very DC type of organization. You were previously at The Hill, which is a very DC news organization, and two that I follow as a DC-based person. And I've noticed over my 2 years in DC, I've gone more to going to the types of organizations that are really focused on policy and Congress, and I'm seeing some other rather than more national brands that they have reporters here too, national brands. Everyone has reporters in Washington, but I feel like when a whole news organization is based here, they get into more policy nuance, whereas the national brands might write for a national audience that don't understand a congressional committee as much, for example. Are you any insights from being from a really Washington-focused media brands?
Yeah.
And should students be modifying their news routines at all if they really want to get into policy nuance?
Yeah, no, okay. So I think it's kind of so there's there's pros and cons. So there's a couple of news organizations that are super focused inside the Beltway. So I worked at one of them, which is The Hill. Politico is another. Axios is another that gets at this really niche minutia. It's these organizations, what they the service basically that they provide to their readers is they know their readers are inside Washington. The readers are probably staffers, lawyers, lobbyists. They want to know about every day, you know, like who's in charge of this committee, what is this committee focusing on. They like, there's nothing that they don't care about in terms of movement in Congress and in the various federal agencies. So that's really, you know, that's really important. But then at the same time, it's like you're, you know, like you're not speaking to a broad audience, you're speaking to a really specific audience, and you're always kind of like keeping that in your head. So that's like the importance of balancing that with national news reporting, which like can sometimes have a better perspective on like what really matters, if that makes sense, like what matters to the general population of the US. So yeah, so I mean, I get all the newsletters in the morning, like a lot of the DC ecosystem is told through like newsletters, like from Politico, from Axios. And I mean, I love to stay informed, and I love the adrenaline and rhythm of politics. Is just like a thing that I like. And so if you like that, then definitely make that part of your news consumption. But I also like, yeah, I always urge everyone to like keep an eye on the national, and then even like an eye on the local, which is like, you know, its own kind of complicated question about the state of local news. But if you can, that's always good for your media diet.
Awesome, thank you. Chloe, I know, has a question or two, so I'll turn it over to one of our students.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for holding this talk today. I'm a senior studying international relations, and I'm from Central Florida. Currently, there was this video of this young woman who went to a local high school who was like slammed by an officer. And this particular high school was in the county where I went to high school. And I remember policies of like not bringing in your cell phone and, you know, not being able to record things. And I know that's a big jump to what I'm connecting to, but I'm trying to create a connection between tech policy and racial injustices in this country. Because like over this past year, you know, a lot of what stirred the country came from these images and these recordings that aren't necessarily allowed or acceptable, but seem very necessary, especially for my experience as a Black woman in America and for like my little cousins. What would you have to say in relation to tech policy and racial justice?
Yeah, I don't think you can separate those two things. I think that as you've described, we've seen over and over again how tech can spur these types of conversations, but we can also see how tech can be used to harm Black communities and surveil them and use the powers of the government against Black and brown communities. And so I think it's really important when we think about privacy issues to think about, as Emily suggested earlier, activist groups who are fighting to make these changes, and whether or not we have a set of rules in place that limit what the government can do in terms of, say, hacking into these activist groups and preventing them from doing their important work. So yeah, I think it's something that we can't separate out.
Yeah, I think a journalist who I really admire in this field said recently that like writing about technology now is writing about civil rights, and like the two are indelibly connected. And I think a lot about like I think one of the most pressing or like obvious areas where this is true is like algorithmic bias. So like when we feed data into some of these systems that is biased, then there is a biased output. So like you think about facial recognition technology is worse at recognizing darker skin tones. It's worse at recognizing specifically Black women. Like that's a pressing technological issue. So like I think a lot about like the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer as well, in which we both saw social media act as like a check on governmental power, and then we saw like extensive surveillance of the protesters and use of social media to track down the protesters later. And I think all of these systems like if you don't acknowledge the way the internet has opened up avenues of communication for marginalized communities, then you don't really understand the internet. But at the same time, you can see how the internet can be like weaponized against those communities. And like, I think it's one of the most like, I think it's one of the most important areas, and there's so many civil rights groups like thinking in that way now, I think, that weren't ever before, like more and more every day. Like I wrote this article a while ago about like misinformation and how like this past election cycle, there was more of an acknowledgement that like misinformation targets minority communities more than any other community. So like if you think about like non-English speaking communities targeted with you know, non-English like, you know, like other misinformation in other languages, like now there's this acknowledgement like never before. And that doesn't mean that everything is fixed or anything, but there are like people thinking in those terms, and I think that's the best thing that could be happening.
Yeah, that's definitely true. In Miami, there's a well-known Spanish disinformation via WhatsApp situation that our own Gordon Institute for Public Policy team has written about in
Yeah.
local media, and that's absolutely true. Great, and thanks to Charlene for posting the relevant article to that question in the chat as well. You know, seeing no further questions, though, I'll give one last chance for anyone to ask something here to our amazing panel. I think we've covered a lot of ground, from foreign policy to the nuances of governmental policy making, to how this all affects you in your daily lives, personally and professionally. So I might just ask if either of you have any closing comment, if something you wanted to say and didn't have the right question to say it, or final words of optimism. Let's see, is this a hand raise? I see.
Oh yeah,
Chloe.
I think Chloe has a
I think
question.
Chloe already asked, right? It was just showing me a hand. Chloe, did you have another one?
I do. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna let Chloe have another one.
It was stimulated by, you know, what you all just shared. Thank you so much. This idea of tech policy, I always felt kind of intimidated by it, because just, I don't know, technology in general just wasn't always encouraged. But now I think it's super important to be aware of. And Section 230, the First Amendment, are important parts to communication in this country, but I'm not, you know, the most versed as far as interacting with people, or, you know, seeing different perspectives on social media accounts. I think it's important to bring up, you know, this idea of what our policy actually is towards a lot of the situations that we see. Well, how would you go about engaging conversations or bringing up, you know, Section 230 in the First Amendment without coming off very like pretentious, or I guess, because I have a wide variety of friends or former clients or people I've worked for, and I see lots of outrageous posts and comments that I'm not trying to, I don't want to learn them. I just want to build a bridge. How have you all had, like, what are ways that you worked to build a bridge or bring up what's going on within the policy in regard to this without offending people, if that's possible?
Well, I think I feel lucky to be talking about technology, which is something that everyone intuitively understands. Every single community uses technology and in some way, and I think it's important to like meet them there first. So it's like this experience you've had with the internet, it matters because like, you know, in this like particular way, to always ground it in like the personal and sort of like come at it from like an educational standpoint. Like I think that's one way that has helped me like even understand things for myself, you know? And I think if the question is like how to have a productive dialogue about it, I think coming at it in the spirit of like mutual learning, like, you know, like what can I learn from you as well, can be helpful. If someone is being outrageous, then they might not deserve that kindness, but that is like a philosophy I have.
Yeah, and I like to approach it in terms of trying to learn what they think about things and why they think about it in those ways. I've found that I've learned a whole lot myself when I do that. So yeah, it can be tricky. I think it's a great question because even though the internet has been around for most of our lives, it still feels like something that's kind of, you know, not real, something that's kind of, you know, just out there that, you know, invisible forces are kind of pulling strings are, but it is here to stay. It's going to affect our lives in so many different ways, and it's so important that we continue to talk about it. And not everyone will feel comfortable talking about every aspect of it, but I think the more we can sort of spark these conversations and just kind of have them and learn from each other, the more we'll come up with creative solutions and hopefully kind of get through some of these tough conversations.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chloe. Well, I'll close I'll frame the closing question this way then. You know, we've recently started with our 46th president, 117th session of Congress. These things don't automatically result in any sort of positive policy change. It's a refreshed opportunity for the public to be engaged in the policy process. You know, what optimistic note or piece of direction do you have for people who care about technology policy, might want to get involved in making it look a little bit more how they want it to look with this new opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting. I've personally never covered an undivided government. And I think that the fact that it opens up new pathways to actually get things done is exciting in and of itself. And I think that like now the opportunity is to like push externally almost to like continue to try to have, you know, whatever you think is important. Like there's like new ways to communicate about that where everything's not constantly like locked in this like partisan bickering. Well, I mean, everything's always locked in partisan bickering, but that, you know, structurally that is somewhat relieved. I think it's really exciting. And like there's more opportunities than ever to get involved in the conversation.
Yes, I second that. I'm not usually one for optimism, but I am hopeful for those same reasons. What terrifies me, I know that you asked a question about optimism, and I'm about to say something very kind of pessimistic. But when I think of members of Congress who openly adhere to conspiracy theories, that concerns me. When they have enormous power and a huge platform to spread disinformation and misinformation, I think that's terrifying. But I think we all, what gives me hope is that we all sort of, a lot of us understand what the problem is. You know, we wouldn't be having an event like this if we didn't know that there was at least a problem. And so that gives me hope. And I'm excited about the fact that so many people are not gonna just kind of give up, and they're gonna continue to try to find a solution to these problems.
Thank you, Orga. Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Charlene and Chloe, for your questions and contributions, and all who tuned in and introduced themselves. It was a pleasure. I appreciate you all, and I wish you a great lunch hour. I was going to say great weekend, but I realize it's only Wednesday, but eventually great weekend. And thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.